The second organ system covered in this unit is the gastrointestinal system, also referred to as the digestive system. As the name suggests, the gastrointestinal system is made up of the gastrointestinal tract and accessory digestive organs, and contributes to homeostasis by breaking down food into forms that can be absorbed and used by the cells of the body. The gastrointestinal system also absorbs water, vitamins and minerals, and assists in eliminating waste. So 4 learning objectives to cover for the anatomy of the gastrointestinal system: to describe the structure and function of the gastrointestinal system, which will involve looking at the organisation of the system, as well as the 6 basic digestive processes that it undertakes. To describe the location and structure of the organs of the gastrointestinal tract. To describe the 4 layers that make up the walls of this gastrointestinal tract. And then to describe the location and the structure of our accessory digestive organs. So getting started with learning objective number 1, to describe the structure and function of the gastrointestinal system. So 2 groups of organs make up the gastrointestinal or the digestive system. We have the gastrointestinal tract, which is made up of the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. And then the accessory digestive organs, which consist of the teeth, tongue, and salivary glands, as well as the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. The gastrointestinal tract is a continuous muscular tube that extends all the way from the mouth through the abdominal cavity to the anus. If it was all at rest and relaxed, it would be about 5 to 7 meters in length. The accessory organs act to aid in digestion, either directly, like the teeth and the tongue, where they contribute to chewing or swallowing, or indirectly, like the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas, which secrete substances into the gastrointestinal tract to assist with chemical digestion, but they never actually come into contact with food. So considering the gastrointestinal system as a whole and not looking at each of the organs individually just yet, and the function of the gastrointestinal system is digestion. But when we look at digestion, we consider it as occurring in 6 basic processes: ingestion, secretion, mixing and propulsion, digestion, absorption, and defecation. So ingestion is the process of taking food and liquids into the mouth. So this is just eating. We eat through our mouth. Secretion is the release of water, acids, buffers, and enzymes into that gastrointestinal tract. And we have a total of about 7 litres of these products that we actually secrete into the tract each day. We have mixing and propulsion. So this is the alternating contraction and relaxation of the smooth muscle in the walls of the gastrointestinal tract. Mixing and propulsion mixes foods with our secretions, as well as move them along the tract towards the anus. We have digestion, which includes both mechanical and chemical breakdown of food. So in mechanical digestion, we're physically breaking down the food molecules. So your teeth, your tongue, and your hard palate, for example, are cutting and grinding the food before it is swallowed. We then have the smooth muscles of the stomach and the small intestine, which will churn and mix up those smaller food pieces. In chemical digestion, we have those larger food molecules or food pieces, which are then split into smaller molecules so that we can actually absorb them into the bloodstream. And this process is catalyzed by digestive enzymes that are secreted by our salivary glands, glands of the stomach, our pancreas, and cells in our small intestine. Absorption is then the movement of the ingested fluid and food molecules into the lining of the gastrointestinal tract, which then moves into the blood and can be circulated to cells throughout the body. Defecation is when waste products, substances that can't be digested or absorbed, and bacteria and cells from the lining, that inner lining of the gastrointestinal tract, leave the body through the anus. The material that is eliminated from the body is what we call feces. So we will go into much more detail about each of these organs specifically and how they play these roles, but just a bit of a visual to give you an idea kind of which organs complete which of those processes. So if we start at the top in the mouth, obviously our mouth is involved in ingestion, but it's also involved in both mechanical and chemical digestion. Mechanical digestion by chewing with the teeth, the tongue, the hard palate, and then chemical digestion, where we have a little bit of a breakdown of the carbohydrate in the mouth through salivary amylase, which is an enzyme released by our salivary glands. We then have the stomach, which also participates in both mechanical and chemical digestion. So mechanical digestion by mixing and churning all of the food. Chemical digestion through the release of some of the digestive enzymes and the hydrochloric acid, which is the acid in your stomach. The liver and pancreas, which are some of our accessory digestive organs, and they play a role in secretion, secreting things like enzymes, pancreatic juice, and bile into the duodenum or into the small intestine. The small intestine then does a lot. It's a big player in our gastrointestinal system. It can be involved in mechanical digestion via segmentation, which is a bit of a mixing of food with the digestive enzymes. We have chemical digestion because we release a lot of our enzymes into the small intestine. And then we have absorption. So the small intestine is actually our major site of nutrient absorption in the body. So that function is really important here. We then have the large intestine, which does a little bit of breakdown of the ingested foods by bacteria. We have most of our absorption of water, and then the beginning of the formation of our feces. We then have the rectum and the anus, which is that very last portion of our gastrointestinal tract. And this is obviously where we eliminate that waste product via feces. Moving on to learning objective number 2, and here we will take a closer look at the location and structure of the organs that make up the gastrointestinal tract. So as a reminder, the gastrointestinal tract, which is that long muscular tube, is made up of the mouth, which is also sometimes known as the oral cavity or the buccal cavity, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. So starting with the mouth, and our mouth is located right up the top here. And our mouth is formed by the cheeks and the lips, the hard and soft palates, and the tongue. So the cheeks form the lateral walls of our oral cavity. They're covered externally by skin and internally by a mucous membrane. At the front, particularly when our mouth is closed, we have our lips, which are fleshy folds that surround the opening of our mouth. Muscles in the cheeks and the lips will assist with chewing, but also play a role in things like speech. The palate is a wall or septum that separates the oral cavity from the nasal cavity, and it's what forms the roof of your mouth. This structure is important because it makes it possible to chew and breathe at the same time. The hard palate is the anterior portion of the roof of your mouth. So if you stick your tongue up or a finger up into the roof of your mouth, that hard bony part that you can feel, this is your hard palate. And it's made up of your maxilla and palatine bones, and it's covered in a mucous membrane. The soft palate is then the posterior portion of the roof of your mouth. So if you kind of got your finger or your tongue and you're pushing that the bony section. If you move your finger back towards the back of your throat, it will become soft. This is your soft palate. And this is a muscular shaped partition, also covered with a mucous membrane, and it particularly functions to separate the oropharynx from the nasopharynx, which we'll discuss shortly. Hanging from the middle posterior part of your soft palate is what we call the uvula. And the role of the uvula is to, during swallowing, close the nasopharynx off to food and liquids. So if you think about ingesting food, you put food or liquid into your mouth. When you swallow, you want that food to go down your throat and not up out your nose. The uvula is what blocks off the nasal cavity so food doesn't come out the other way. Within our mouth, we also have obviously the teeth, the salivary glands, and the tongue. But these are classified as our accessory digestive organs, and so we will talk about those structures specifically in a few learning objectives to come. Now, there's lots of arrows and lots of things to look at here, but there are only a few that I really wanted you to be worried about. Hopefully, we all know what our cheeks are, but our cheeks are these lateral walls of the mouth here. We have our superior and our inferior lips, which fall in that anterior portion of our mouth. We have the hard palate, which is that bony anterior portion of the roof of your mouth. The soft palate, which is the muscular, softer part of the roof of your mouth, and then the uvula, which is that hanging projection that when you swallow blocks off your nose so that the food and the liquid doesn't come out your nose. Showing you the uvula in action, on this side here we've got your tongue, we've got some food to be swallowed, we've got your hard palate made up of bone, your soft palate made up of muscle and a mucous membrane, and then your uvula down here. Up here, we have your nasal cavity. As you swallow and the tongue pushes that food up and then down your throat, that uvula will block off the access to the nasopharynx or the nasal cavity, so food can only go down into your pharynx and your esophagus and not up back out your nose. We then have the pharynx, which colloquially can be referred to as the throat. When food is swallowed, it passes from the mouth into the pharynx. The pharynx is composed of skeletal muscle and it's lined by a mucous membrane, and it's divided into three separate parts. We have the nasopharynx, which is a section behind the nose or the nasal cavity. We have the oropharynx, which is the portion behind the oral cavity. And then we have the laryngopharynx, which is a section behind the larynx. So all things going well, the nasopharynx only functions in respiration and breathing, whereas both our oropharynx and our laryngopharynx have both respiratory and digestive functions. So swallowed food passes from the mouth first into the oropharynx and then the laryngopharynx, and the contractions of the skeletal muscle in this area is what helps propel or move the food then down into the down into the esophagus and then the stomach. One other structure that I wanted to point out that sits in the laryngopharynx is what we call the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a flap of elastic cartilage which is also covered by a mucous membrane, and it acts a little bit like the uvula. But in this case, it will actually flap down. It will cover the opening to the trachea when you swallow, so that the food and the liquid that you've ingested will go down into the esophagus and not down your trachea or your windpipe. So taking a closer look at some of those structures. So this whole section along here, we consider the pharynx. This portion behind the nasal cavity is what we call the nasopharynx. This portion kind of from here to here, which is behind the oral cavity, is our oropharynx. And then if this structure here is our larynx, kind of near your voice box, this part of the pharynx here is our laryngopharynx. Now, what happens when you swallow food? Remember, we swallow food, the tongue pushes it up and down into the esophagus. If we have a look at this image now, the uvula will block off access to the nasal cavity, so the food only moves down into the esophagus. What happens down here is this flap of cartilage will then cover the opening to our trachea or our windpipe, so that the food has to go down the esophagus and not down the trachea into our lungs. As we have mentioned, after the mouth and the pharynx, the swallowed food and liquid then passes down into our esophagus. The esophagus is a collapsible muscular tube, so it's not actually held open. It's about 25 centimeters long, and it lies just posterior or just behind your trachea or your windpipe. The esophagus starts at the inferior end of your laryngopharynx. It passes through the diaphragm where it meets the superior portion or the top part of your stomach. At the very top of the esophagus is our upper esophageal sphincter. This is a circle of skeletal muscle which regulates the passage of food from the pharynx into the esophagus. Now, because it is made up of skeletal muscle, it is under voluntary control, so we can choose when we swallow food and have it move from the pharynx or our throat into the esophagus. At the lower end of the esophagus, which is opening up into the stomach, is our lower esophageal sphincter, also called the cardiac sphincter, and this is made up of smooth muscle and regulates the movement of food from the esophagus into the stomach. Now, because it is made up of smooth muscle, we cannot consciously or voluntarily control this sphincter. So we can't control when we have that movement of food going from the esophagus into the stomach. The esophagus only has one role: to move food from the mouth down into our stomach. It does not produce any digestive enzymes, and it does not carry out any absorption. So a diagram of the esophagus in action. We have our bolus of food, which is just what we call basically a clump of food coming down the esophagus. We're going to talk about the layers or the walls of the gastrointestinal tract in the next learning objective, but we have circular muscles which contract kind of squeezing around the esophagus like this. We also have longitudinal muscles that contract kind of in a wave-like fashion, pushing the food down in this direction. That bolus of food will then reach the lower esophageal sphincter, which remember is our smooth muscle sphincter, which when that opens, it will move into the stomach. The stomach is then a large J-shaped enlargement of the gastrointestinal tract, so it's just like a broader, wider part of that muscular tube, and it sits directly inferior to the diaphragm in the abdomen. So think about your ribs and your lungs underneath your ribs. Sitting directly underneath that is your diaphragm. So your stomach is just underneath that diaphragm, so it's quite high up. The stomach connects the esophagus to the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. And because a meal can be eaten much more quickly than the intestines can actually digest and absorb it, one of the functions of the stomach is to act as a temporary storage site for food and liquid. At appropriate intervals after food is ingested, the stomach will force a small quantity of digested food into the small intestines through the pyloric sphincter. The pyloric sphincter is a smooth muscle sphincter which regulates the movement of food from the stomach to the small intestine. So again, smooth muscle, so not under voluntary control. Because your stomach is continually being filled and then emptied and then refilled, the size of your stomach will vary considerably. Empty, the stomach is about the size of your fist, but it will expand to a certain extent to fit whatever you eat and drink. Inside of the stomach, we have large folds of the mucous membrane called gastric rugae, and these these structures are what allow the stomach to stretch and expand while it is filled. So a close-up image of the stomach. I'm not going to test you on this, but the top part of the stomach is called the fundus. This bottom part is called the pylorus, hence why we have the pyloric sphincter. This medial border of the stomach is what we call the lesser curvature, and the lateral border is our greater curvature. Down here, you can see that smooth muscle pyloric sphincter, which will regulate the movement from the stomach into the first part of the small intestine. These little curved wrinkles on the inside of the stomach are our gastric rugae, or our rugae of the mucosa, which, remember, is what allows the stomach to actually expand when it is filled and then retract when it is empty. From the stomach, the digested food then makes its way to the small intestine, and the small intestine is divided into 3 regions. The first part of the small intestine is the duodenum. It starts at the pyloric sphincter of the stomach and is roughly the first 25 centimeters of the small intestine. The next portion is the jejunum, which is about 1 meter long. And the last portion is the ileum, which is about 2 meters long and joins to the large intestine at a smooth muscle sphincter called the ileocecal sphincter or the ileocecal valve. Now, I want to point out here that we will not ask you to distinguish between the 3 regions of the small intestine. If you look on an image like this, or if you look at a cadaver, to the naked eye, you cannot tell the difference between those 3 regions. I simply want you to know the order that they occur in. Now, most of the digestion and the absorption of nutrients, which occurs in the entire gastrointestinal tract, actually occurs in the small intestine. And so aside from these 3 sections, the small intestine is structured to maximize these functions. So we will take a closer look at this in the next learning objective, but the inner lining of the small intestines contain 3 specialized features. We have circular folds, which are folds around the small intestine. They're folds of the mucosa and the submucosa, which are the 2 inner layers of the wall of the gastrointestinal tract. And these help to enhance absorption by increasing surface area, as well as causing the digested food to actually spiral around the small intestine instead of just passing quickly through. We have villi, which are finger-like projections of the mucosa, so the inner layer of the gastrointestinal tract. These are about 0.5 to 1 millimeter long, and they help increase the surface area. We then have microvilli, which are even smaller finger-like projections, which project out of the surface of the villi. And of course, they act to further increase that surface area. The increased surface area due to these cells or these structures allow for greater contact of the ingested food to cells that secrete digestive enzymes, as well as contact with absorptive cells, which help actually absorb the nutrients out of the food and then go into the blood. So to show you what that looks like in real life, and this is a section taken from the wall of the duodenum. So the duodenum is where most of that absorption and digestion actually takes place. And on the left, you can see the villi. So if these are some of the layers of the gastrointestinal tract, we have the muscularis, then the submucosa and the mucosa, with the mucosa being the layer closest to the lumen of the small intestine or where the food will sit. Our villi are these finger-like projections that stick out of that mucosa. If you then look on this image on the right here, so these are the villi of our mucosa. If you look really closely, there are all these little projections that stick out from the very border of that villi. These are our microvilli. You will also see them referred to as a brush border because it looks a little bit like a hairbrush. And all of these little structures will help increase that surface area really dramatically. Finally, we have the large intestine, which is the last section of the gastrointestinal tract. The functions of the large intestine are to complete absorption of any nutrients that have been left, the production of certain vitamins that we can't produce elsewhere, and then, of course, the formation and the expulsion of feces. The large intestine is only 1.5 meters long, but it's about 6.5 centimeters in diameter. So it's quite thick and broad compared to the small intestine, and that's why we call it the large intestine. The large intestine extends from the ileum of the small intestine all the way down to the anus. So the large intestine we also consider to be in 4 different regions. We have the cecum, the colon, the rectum, and the anal canal. So the first portion is the cecum, and that is this kind of little pouch-like structure just at the very start of our large intestine. It connects to the ileocecal valve and controls the movement of food from the small intestine into the large intestine. Hanging off, if you can see there, the cecum is a coiled, twisted structure, and this is what we call the appendix. We're not entirely sure the function of the appendix, but if you've ever had your appendix out, that is the structure that they will have removed. We then have the colon, and the colon is made up of 4 different sections. We have the ascending colon, which, as the name suggests, it ascends or goes up along the right side of the body. The transverse colon runs horizontally under the liver and the stomach here. We then have the descending colon, which moves down the left side of the abdominal cavity. And then this last portion here is our sigmoid colon, which is kind of curved and shaped a little bit like an S. The rectum is then the vertical section of the large intestine that goes from the sigmoid colon to the anal canal. The anal canal is simply the final 2 to 3 centimeters of the rectum, so the very, very last portion of the large intestine. The opening of the anal canal to the external environment is what we call the anus. And the anus is guarded by both an internal anal sphincter, which is made up of smooth muscle, so meaning that it's under involuntary control, as well as an external anal sphincter, which is made up of skeletal muscle and which is under voluntary control, and which is what you have to consciously release to go to the bathroom. So taking a bit of a closer look at those different sections. So we have our cecum, which is where the small intestine meets the large intestine, and we have our ileocecal sphincter. This structure here was our appendix. We have our ascending colon ascending up the right side of the body, transverse colon moving horizontally, the descending colon going along the left side of the body, the sigmoid colon shaped a little bit like an S along here. The rectum is that vertical portion of our large intestine with the anal canal the last few centimeters, and then the anus, the opening to the external environment. Here, I just wanted to point out those 2 sphincters. So we have the internal anal sphincter, which is smooth muscle, and so it's unconsciously controlled. It will relax when it gets pressure on mechanical receptors. Our external anal sphincter is skeletal muscle and is therefore under voluntary control. Okay, so now we've looked at the organs or the structures that make up the gastrointestinal tract. We're now going to move on to learning objective number 3, which is to describe the 4 layers that form the wall of that long gastrointestinal tract. So the wall of the gastrointestinal tract from the lower esophagus all the way to the anal canal has the same basic 4-layered arrangement of tissues. The 4 layers of tissues from deep to superficial, so the innermost layer to the outer layer, are the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis, and the serosa. So starting with the deepest or the innermost layer, which is called the mucosa, and this inner lining of the gastrointestinal tract as the name suggests, is a mucous membrane. It's comprised of a layer of epithelial tissue in direct contact with the contents of the gastrointestinal tract, a layer of connective tissue, which we call the lamina propria, and then a thin layer of smooth muscle. The epithelium in the mouth, the pharynx, and the esophagus and the anal canal is mainly non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So lots of words there, but it's basically lots of layers of square-shaped cells. And this serves to protect the tissue underneath from the food, the digestive substances, the digestive enzymes that we find in the gastrointestinal tract. In the stomach and the intestines, where secretion and absorption are much more important, the epithelium is mostly simple columnar, which is just a single layer of column-shaped cells. So as you can imagine, being in contact with the digested food and digestive enzymes every day can be quite taxing or damaging on this tissue. So the turnover of epithelial cells in this layer is really high, with the cells being completely replaced every 5 to 7 days. This layer also contains many exocrine glands, which secrete mucus and other fluid into the tract, which helps further protect that underlying tissue. The middle layer of the mucosa is areolar connective tissue. It contains lots of blood and lymphatic vessels, which is how some of the nutrients are absorbed into the gastrointestinal tract. They go into the blood and then to other tissues of the body. That outer layer of the mucosa is the thin layer of smooth muscle fibers. And this is what actually causes that mucous membrane of the stomach and the small intestines to be folded and kind of wrinkly in appearance to increase that surface area. So taking a look at what that mucosa layer looks like. So our mucosous layer, remember, is the innermost or the deepest layer. It's the layer that comes into contact with the digested food and the digestive products. So we have the epithelia, which is the very inner layer, the lamina propria, which is that connective tissue layer that has blood and lymph vessels, and then the muscularis layer, which is what allows the folding or the lumps and bumps of that inner lining of the gastrointestinal tract. Moving superficially, so we've gone from the very deepest or the innermost layer, we're now moving slightly outward. This layer that sits on top of the mucosa is called the submucosa. And this submucosa consists of areolar connective tissue that binds the mucosa to the muscularis layer, which is the next layer up. And like the connective tissue in the mucosa, it contains lots and lots of blood and lymph vessels that receive that absorbed food molecules. Also located in the submucosa is a plexus of nerves known as the submucosal plexus. And these help control the release of digestive enzymes and secretions from both endocrine and exocrine glands, as well as the transmission of sensory information from the gut. So taking another look at this image, we have our mucosa, which is the innermost layer. We then have our submucosa. It's quite a nice thick layer. It contains connective tissue, lymph vessels, blood vessels, and nerves. So you can see our submucosal plexus here. All these yellow tubes are indicating that submucosal plexus or that network of neurons. Continuing to move superficially, and our next layer is the muscularis. The muscularis of the mouth, the pharynx, and the superior and middle parts of the esophagus contain skeletal muscle. So this is what allows us to decide when we want to swallow. Skeletal muscle also forms the external anal sphincter and permits the voluntary control of defecation. Throughout the rest of the gastrointestinal tract, so from basically the lower esophagus all the way to that external anal sphincter, we have a layer of smooth muscle, and it's typically found in 2 layers or 2 sheets. We have an inner circular layer and an outer longitudinal layer. So involuntary contractions of this smooth muscle will help break down food, mix it with the digestive secretions, and then propel it along the gastrointestinal tract. Between the layers of the muscularis is a second plexus of neurons, or a second network of neurons. This is called the myenteric plexus. And this plexus mostly controls the frequency and the strength of the contractions along the gastrointestinal tract. It's how it mixes up all the food and how it moves the food from one end of the tract to the other through a specific type of contraction, which we call peristalsis, and which we'll talk about in the next lecture. So once again, taking a look at this image, we had our mucosa, which is our inner layer, then our submucosa, and then our muscularis. Here we're showing those two sheets of smooth muscle that are most of the gastrointestinal tract from the lower esophagus down. We have the inner circular layer, which kind of contracts around the tract, and then our outer longitudinal tract, which will contract along the tract. We have our myenteric plexus here. So remember, my means muscle, enteric means gut. So this basically controls the contraction of the gastrointestinal tract, so both our stomach and our small intestine. Lastly, and most superficially, we have our serosa, sometimes also called the adventitia. This is a serous membrane composed of areolar connective tissue and simple squamous epithelium, so a single layer of square-shaped cells. The serosa can also be called the visceral peritoneum because it forms the part of the peritoneum which lines the abdominal cavity and then the abdominal organs. The serous membrane secretes a lubricating fluid to reduce friction from when our organs and our muscles kind of rub together with movement of the body. So looking at this image one last time, our mucosa is the middle layer, the inner layer, then our submucosa, the muscularis, and then our serosa, mostly made up of that connective tissue and the epithelium. It secretes the lubricating fluid, so when it comes into contact with other parts of its own organ or a different organ or even muscles of the abdominal region, it can slide over one another and not rub together and cause friction. Now on to our final learning objective for the anatomy of the gastrointestinal system, which is to take a look at the organs of the gastrointestinal system, that's hard to say, that we have not looked at so far. So learning objective number 4 is to describe the location and structure of the accessory digestive organs. So the accessory digestive organs are the organs of the gastrointestinal system that do not make up the gastrointestinal tract. So they function to aid in digestion, whether that be mechanically, like in the case of the teeth, or chemically by releasing digestive enzymes in the case of the pancreas and the salivary glands. The accessory digestive organs that we will focus on in this unit are the teeth, the tongue, the salivary glands, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. Now, because of their proximity to one another, as well as the fact that they function together, I'm going to group the accessory digestive organs of the mouth. So these are the teeth, the tongue, and the salivary glands. So taking a look at each of these organs or structures, and obviously we have our teeth here. We have a row up the top and then a row at the bottom. In humans, we have primary teeth or baby teeth, which generally start to emerge around about 6 months of age. And they typically, of course, this varies between infants, but they will typically continue to erupt about every 2 months until all 20 teeth are present. The teeth closest to the front, so these 4 here and these 4 here, are what we call incisors, and these help cut up our food. Moving posteriorly, so this way, here and here, we have our canine teeth. These are pointier and they're designed for tearing and shredding up our food. Again, moving towards the back and on the sides, we then have our molars. These are flatter teeth and they're used to crush and grind food. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to name each of those teeth. I just want you to be aware that there are different shapes and different types, and they all have slightly different functions. We then have our tongue, which sits on and makes up the floor of our oral cavity or of our mouth. Our tongue is skeletal muscle covered in a mucous membrane. Because it's skeletal muscle, we have voluntary control over our tongue. It's what allows us to swallow, also what allows us to talk. The tongue is covered with papillae, or little bumps, which not only contain taste buds or gustatory receptors, but also act to increase the friction between your tongue and the food, making it easier for for your tongue to move the food around the oral cavity. We then have our salivary glands depicted on this other image here. And there are 3 salivary glands that we're going to focus on in this unit. Of course, there are more than just these 3. We have the parotid salivary gland, which is located inferior and anterior to your ear, so kind of just below and in front of your ear. This gland secretes saliva into the mouth through a duct up near one of the maxillary molars, so kind of up the top part of your mouth about here. The duct to the parotid salivary gland will open up there. We then have the sublingual gland. This sits underneath the tongue and secretes saliva into the floor of the mouth. And we have the submandibular, so if your mandible is this bone here, your submandibular gland, which is also found on the floor of the mouth and also secretes saliva just under the tongue. Moving on to our next accessory digestive organs, and these are the liver and the gallbladder. And again, I have grouped these together because of their proximity to one another as well as their function. So the liver is this kind of reddy brown organ here. And the liver is actually the heaviest gland of the body. It weighs about 1.4 kilos. And of all of the organs in the human body, it is second only to the skin in how large it is. So it is our second biggest organ. The liver sits inferior to the diaphragm. So if your ribs and your lungs are kind of up here, your diaphragm runs along here, your liver is just underneath the diaphragm. And it takes up a really large portion of that upper abdominal cavity. Worth taking a look at the liver in the cadavers and in the plastic models in the lab, because it is surprising how large the liver is. The liver is covered by the visceral peritoneum. So it's a layer of connective tissue, which, as I've said, lines the abdominal cavity and our organs. And the liver's broken up into 2 different lobes. So we have a large right lobe and a slightly smaller left lobe. We're going to look at the histology or the makeup of the liver more closely on the next slide. But our liver is made up of what we call hepatocytes. The gallbladder is this greeny little organ here, a little bit hard to see in this image. It's a pear-shaped sac that's located on the posterior surface of the liver. It's about 7 to 10 centimeters long, and it typically hangs inferiorly towards the intestines. The gallbladder is also entirely covered by that peritoneum. Now, one of the functions of the liver is to produce bile. Bile exits the liver through the common hepatic duct into the gallbladder, where it's then stored and concentrated. When it is stimulated to release the bile then heads out of the gallbladder towards the duodenum, or that first part of the small intestine. It goes through the cystic duct and then into the common bile duct. So looking at the makeup of the liver more closely, and I said that the liver is made up of hepatocytes, And these little cells here is what the hepatocytes look like. The hepatocytes are the major functional cells of the liver, so they're like the liver cells, and they perform a really wide range of metabolic, of secretory, of endocrine functions. Now, hepatocytes are specialized endothelial cells with 5 to 12 sides, so if you think like the side of a shape, and they make up 80% of the volume of the liver. Between each of our hepatocytes are bile caniculi. So if all of these little red kind of square shapes are our hepatocytes or our liver cells, this green line along here is what we call our bile caniculi. The bile caniculi transports the bile, which has been produced in the hepatocytes. They then pass into a bile duct, which then merge and eventually form the right and the left hepatic ducts, which then converge and exit the liver into the duodenum or into the gallbladder via the common hepatic duct. At the corner of each hepatocyte is what we call a portal triad, which is like a collection of vessels. The portal triad consists of branch of a bile duct, a branch of the hepatic artery, and a branch of the hepatic portal vein. The bile duct carries the bile, which is produced by the hepatocytes. The hepatic artery carries oxygen-rich blood to the liver. And then the hepatic portal vein receives deoxygenated but really nutrient-rich blood from the gastrointestinal tract, then delivers it to the liver, before it then gets returned back into normal circulation, back to the heart via the hepatic vein and the inferior vena cava. So the hepatic portal vein is a bit of an anomaly within the human body. The vein doesn't just go back towards the heart, it goes back into the liver so those nutrients can go to the liver, and then goes back into the circulation and back towards the heart via the hepatic vein and the inferior vena cava. And the last accessory organ and the last 2 slides of this lecture are looking at the pancreas. And the pancreas is this yellow, I always kind of think it looks a little bit like a cob of corn looking structure that's partly hidden by the stomach and the pancreas. Along with the liver, the pancreas also sits behind the peritoneum. It's about 12 to 15 centimeters in length and about 2.5 centimeters thick. It sits in one of the curves of the small intestine, and it opens up into the duodenum via 2 ducts called the pancreatic and the accessory ducts. The pancreatic duct is the larger of the 2 ducts, and it joins a common bile duct from the liver and the gallbladder, where it then enters the duodenum via the hepatopancreatic duct. The accessory duct empties directly into the duodenum, and it sits a couple of centimeters above this hepatopancreatic duct. So once more, taking a closer look at those structures, this is our cob of corn looking pancreas here, and you can see it sitting in one of the curves of the small intestine, particularly the duodenum. Remembering the pancreas has both endocrine and exocrine functions, which we'll talk about more in the next lecture. But for the exocrine function, pancreatic juices are released into the pancreatic and the accessory duct. You can see our pancreatic duct along here, our accessory duct along here. The accessory duct empties directly into the duodenum. That pancreatic duct joins with our common bile duct, which is coming from the liver and the gallbladder, joins to form our hepatopancreatic duct, and then empties into the duodenum. So that is the anatomy of the gastrointestinal system. Again, as with every lecture, a lot to understand and wrap your head around. I appreciate that. The next lecture is looking at the physiology of the gastrointestinal system and how all of these structures work together to actually digest and absorb our food. We'll also cover this all again in the labs, so hopefully by the end of the week, you will have all of this down pat.